The 83-year-old at the time poet, Mary Oliver, died 1,362 days ago. How and why she was able in her career to capture the imaginations and the admiration and love, quite frankly, of so many people is the question we're going to ask and address today, which means you are listening to Poetry, Gossip, and the Pursuit of Pleasure with Dale Byron. That's me. This is the place where we explore the creative and practical ways that poetry can help us in our everyday lives, finding little pockets of joy, sanity, and connectedness with the poetry. Okay, so of all the poets I've included in my talks, salons and workshops and one-on-one coaching settings over many years, Mary Oliver has been, I would say, the most known and loved and quoted, even quite honestly, among people that didn't track poetry that much or weren't that familiar with poetry in a more depthful sense. They still knew her, and many loved her. I also recommended so many of her poems. I recommended them so often for different occasions and different situations that I, quite frankly, lost track. Although I have many stories about Mary Oliver poems and people that responded to them in quite positive ways. So, by selecting some of her best work today for this a tribute to Mary Oliver episode of the podcast, I want to try to delve into how and why, again, so many people loved her work. And so let's get started. Let's get started. Mary Oliver was probably most known, most well known for a poem called The Summer Day. And it's often considered her most famous. And see if that tracks with your knowledge of Mary Oliver, if you were familiar with her. So let's just jump right into the poem, The Summer Day by Mary Oliver. Who made the world? Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? The grasshopper, I mean, the one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps. She snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Tell me what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? You know, I have said on this podcast before that every poem is a miracle, but some poems rise to the level of art. And when I say that, what I mean is that a poem at the level of art is one that allows us, each of us, to walk inside the poem and have our own unique and satisfying experience. And I think one of the reasons this poem and Mary Oliver in general has been so popular is because there is a walk-in ability in her poetry, so many of her poems, where we can walk inside Now, the other thing that I believe that good or poems that rise to the highest level of art, in my humble opinion, are poems that offer a kind of surprise, a kind of kind of a moment where the poet, as Ezra Pound once said, the poet must be surprised or the reader will not be either. And so you just get the feeling that as Mary Oliver was putting pen to paper, that she found herself at the end of this poem as surprised as we find ourselves at the end of this poem reading it or hearing it. So and when she says this delicious line, I don't know. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day, all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Maybe what is so amazing and marvelous about this poem is that it is confrontive on one level. It asks us a really bold and fierce question. What do you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? However, it's also it's not a scolding question, I don't think. It's an opening question. It's a question of sinking deeper into our lives, into our own experience, so that we can ask ourselves a very important question. Now, the author, Cheryl Strayed, used this final couplet of the summer day as this writer said, where I pull this little quote from Mary Oliver's most famous poem, as we've already talked about. And this was in a memoir, which I think was actually made into a movie called Wild, which I think I saw. uh, where, tell me what it is you plan to do with your one wild and precious life. Also, in a podcast and a show that's been around for a while called On Being by Krista Tippett. And I would recommend the show if you enjoy literature and poetry in particular, because she covers that a lot. But she was interviewing Mary Oliver for her radio show, again, On Being. And she referred to Oliver's poem, Wild Geese, which we're going to cover in just a few moments, which offers a consoling vision of the redemption possible in ordinary life as a poem that has saved lives. So there's a little preamble to the poem we'll do in just a minute. But what's amazing is that these poems are they're beloved by so many people, and it is a different poem. The Summer Day is a different poem for me, a different poem for you, which means that it allows us to walk inside and have our own unique experience. Okay, let's keep cooking. Now, another poem that I have recommended and used in so many groups, so many times with individuals as well. It's called The Journey. The Journey. And as I speak this poem, then you'll know whether you've ever heard it before. And if you haven't, I think you're in for a treat. The Journey by Mary Oliver. One day you finally knew. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice. I love that line. One day you finally knew what you had to do, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice. Though the whole house began to tremble, and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. But you didn't stop. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough. It was already late enough, and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. That image is so amazing. And I don't know about you, but it makes me feel that sense of what it's like when we are being confronted in this way by people who are saying, save my life, save my life. And you've got to make the decision that Mary Oliver is going to talk about in just a moment. Okay, back to the poem. And the road full of fallen branches and stones, but little by little, but little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds. And there was a new voice, and there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company, that kept you company, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. But little by little, but little by little, as you left their voices behind, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice. And there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, as your own, as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. Mary Oliver, The Journey. I've made, at the end, just at the crescendo of that poem, I've said to more than one group, many groups, I would say, have you ever tried to save another human being? Have you ever tried to save another human being at the risk of your own life, at the risk of your own well-being? It's a kind of codependent shuffle, as it were. And I think that anyone who has tried, first of all, if you've ever tried to fix somebody or save somebody or change somebody who did not have any desire to do what you thought was so important. How did that work, by the way? That's a whole nother question. But my point is that if we catch ourselves trying to save everyone else, what kind of energy does that leave for ourselves? I think this poem helps us with that. I also say at the very first of the poem, it says, one day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice. So I've often said that Mary Oliver is, of course, talking about people external to us, and that's one of the main themes in this poem. I think is, as she says at the end, the determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save, and that's not a kind of selfish act when that language comes at the end of this poem. You know that could be a selfish act, but it's not. when it comes to the end. At the end of this poem, it's kind of earned that surprising line at the end. But my point with this beginning thing about though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, I like to say, I like to remind us all, myself included hugely, that often the most difficult voices that we hear that give us bad advice are not outside of us, but are inside of us. Our own voices, those voices that say, you're wrong. You should feel ashamed of yourself. You're bad. You're terrible. Not that you've just done something wrong, but that you are wrong. And that's a whole different kind of thing. And so I think Mary Oliver, on one level, at least this is my projection into this poem, is telling us, yes, of course, be careful of those external voices that are giving you advice that's not really helpful. But also, maybe in particular, be careful of the internal voices that are giving not so good advice. Always reminds me, there's a Goethe line that says, tell a wise person or else keep silent, for those who do not understand will mock it right away. I think this is the same point that Mary Oliver's made. Sometimes we have to look to the wisest part of ourselves for help and advice. One last story about the journey. I've given this poem to so many people. I'm coaching clients that carry the poem around in their wallet after they heard it. Also, I was coaching a young, very brilliant young woman who was just an amazing human being, and amazing at the work she did. And I remember after we'd worked together for some number of months, again in a kind of professional way, my being the coach, and in that particular context. And I remember asking her at one point, I said, which I used to do, just to kind of calibrate the work that I was doing with another person, business person, in most cases. I'd say, of the things we've done together in this coaching context, what do you find to be, some of the most powerful? What has been more memorable for you? And she didn't think very long at all, and she said, "Well, it's that poem you gave me." And I thought to myself, the first thought was, of all the powerful tools and things I've said to you and conversations we've had and insights, that is the main thing. Of course, I'm just kidding. I was delighted that she said that. I was delighted that she said that, because she had gotten tremendous insight about how she was putting herself at the end of the line often in terms of her own needs. And this poem was a kind of elixir. It was a kind of first aid kit. It was a kind of our first aid kit poem. And it was also a deepening poem at the same time, which had her really making some pretty significant changes in her life. So anyway, so many stories about that particular poem, but let's move on, because we've got some other wonderful poems that we don't want to miss today. Oh, there was one note I wanted to, I made for myself. This was something that someone said. They said, in keeping with the American impulse toward self-improvement, the transformation Oliver seeks is both simpler and more explicit in her readers. Unlike Rilke, the German poet, she offers a blueprint for how to go about it. Just pay attention, she says, to the natural world around you, to the goldfinches, the swan, the wild geese, which is where we're going next. They will tell you what you need to know. With a few exceptions, Oliver's poems don't end in thunderbolts. Theirs is a gentler form of moral direction. Well, I'm not quite so sure I totally agree. I think she does do some thunderbolt, surprising points in her poems, particularly at the end. But anyway, I get the point being made. And I would say that, I would say that so many, my own experience of working with people with Mary Oliver poems, so many of them have been helpful for people having these insights, having these kinds of moments of increased awareness, which are always, always powerful, always powerful. Awareness is curative, as I always say. Okay, the Wild Geese is the next poem, the next Mary Oliver poem we're going to do. And this has a brilliant line that starts the poem. Oh, I love it. She says it like this: Wild geese, you do not have to be good. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. Now, you can walk thousands of miles in those first three lines. You can just go. Remember, we said step inside, have your own experience, have your own experience. And we just jump right into this poem in that way. You do not have to be good. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only, you only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading back home again, are heading back home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. How often do we put ourselves outside of our own heart? How often do we withhold empathy, forgiveness, understanding, even? We withhold it from ourselves. I think this poem is an amazing poem. Again, I'm big on first aid poems, poems that we can go to when we're in a kind of, I don't know, anxious crisis, when we're feeling particularly in a difficult uh, place. But this is also it, and it's that this poem is definitely that. But it's also a deepening poem. I think it deepens our experience of connection with ourselves, with empathy for ourselves, with um, a kind of understanding, and just kind of giving ourselves a break. I used to ask my coaching clients and others, and I meant, I would say this a little tongue in cheek, but I would say, listen, in our work together, why don't you pretend that you're on your side? I'm going to do a whole episode on that at some point, but why don't you pretend that you're on your side? And, people would always chuckle, but I was also serious. I was also serious because this poem, as it ends, I mean, just the permission, deep permission. You do not have to be good is how it starts. You do not have to be good. How many times do you tell yourself that? No, no. We are telling ourselves we have to be perfect. We have to be amazingly good all the time. We've got to be operating at this level. And I'm not saying that that's not, sometimes that kind of urge to do something masterful is a good thing. I'm not saying it's all negative, but it can be very disempowering. It can reduce our sense of agency as opposed to increase it if we think we have to be perfect all the time. That every time we sit down to write something, it's got to be, a Pulitzer Prize winning effort or some such thing. Yeah. By the way, Mary Oliver did win a Pulitzer Prize, as well as many other awards and all that good stuff. You do not have to be good, she says. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only, you only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again, whoever you are, no matter how lonely. The world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Again, this kind of ability with an artful poem to walk inside of it and have our own experience, to heal, to be confronted in a positive way, to gain new levels of awareness. That's the mark of a good poem. I think this one qualifies. Okay, as we always say, we are headed toward the barn. This is our last poem in our tribute to Mary Oliver, as we're answering the question, how and why was she able to captivate so many hearts and imaginations with her work? Even though, by the way, she was criticized at times by certain, literary critics. She was not without her critics, and I guess what's true if is would be the idea that if your literature pleased everyone, that it would be for no one. So I happen to think that her work was just absolutely amazing on so many levels. Okay, this last poem is one that I have provided to so many people in times of grief. And again, this is a testimony. I sound like a broken record today, but it's a testimony to how versatile a poem is, so that, and how much we each can have our own experience walking inside the poem, being inside the poem. In other words, like we said before, it goes so deep into the personal that it comes out in the universal. And I think this poem fits that bill. And it's the reason that I've recommended it to so many people who have been in a time of grief, which you'll understand in just a moment if you've never heard the poem, or you may remember if you have. Blackwater Woods. Poem goes like this. Look, the trees are turning their own bodies into pillars of light, are giving off the rich fragrance of cinnamon and fulfillment. The long tapers of cattails are bursting and floating away over the blue shoulders of the ponds, and every pond, no matter what its name is nameless now. Every year, everything I have ever learned in my lifetime leads back to this: the fires and the black river of loss, whose other side is salvation, whose meaning none of us will ever know. To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it. And when the time comes, to let it go. to let it go. Every year, everything I've ever learned in my lifetime leads back to this: the fires and the black river of loss, whose other side is salvation, whose meaning none of us will ever know. To live in this world, to live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing that your own life depends on it. And when the time comes, to let it go, to let it go. And when the time comes, to let it go, to let it go. That was Mary Oliver, or that was from her collection called American Primitive in 1983. As I mentioned, she won more awards than you can shake a stick at for her work. She once said, Mary Oliver once said, "May I be the tiniest nail in the house of the universe, tiny but useful." And she wrote someplace else that everything, or she felt that everything must eventually find its proper place. Yeah, that poem has been one that I have recommended to so many people. And I think in that sense, it's it's done a lot of healing in the world. Uh, Again, as we're getting ready, we're almost at the close of our episode today. I wanted to make note of something I read. Said Mary Oliver, in a Times profile a few years ago, put it as she put it in this profile, likes to present herself as the kind of old-fashioned poet who walks the woods most days, accompanied by dog and notepad. She picked up the habit as a child in Maple Heights, Ohio, is where she was born, where she was born in 1935, walking the woods with Whitman in her knapsack. Good companion. Was her escape from an unhappy home life, a sexually abusive father, and a neglectful mother. It was a very dark and broken house that I came from, she told Krista Tippett, who I mentioned before, is a brilliant interviewer. Mary Oliver said, "To this day, I don't care for the enclosure of buildings." She began writing poetry at the age of 13. "I made a world out of words," she told in another interview. She told Shriver in an interview in O magazine, and it was my salvation. She made a world out of words, and as she said, it was her salvation. Nature, with its endless cycles, the article went on, nature with its endless cycles of death and rebirth fascinated Mary Oliver. Walking in the woods, she developed a method that became the hallmark of her poetry, taking notice simply of whatever was present there. Like Rumi, another of her models, it's a pretty good model to have. Oliver wanted to combine the spiritual life with the concrete, an encounter with a deer, the kisses of a lover, even a deformed and stillborn kitten. Mary Oliver once said to pay attention, this is our endless and proper work. Yeah, that was in one of the prose books that she wrote about poetry. And she also said, when you write a poem, you write it for anybody and everybody. That was a point I made a little bit earlier. And this was a quote from Mary Oliver. I was going to say that not everybody was pleased with her work, of course. A critic of Mary Oliver once scoffed at the whole idea of her poems, or any poems, being practically helpful to humans. He said something like, if poetry worked as self-help, then far more poets would be driving around in fancy cars. But let me add my little comment to that. I think the guy is missing the whole point. I really think he's missing the whole point with this idea of, poets driving around in fancy cars. Although Mary Oliver actually made quite a good financial living from her work, one of few poets who could fill a room up, I know, because I attended a reading that she gave at as I recall, the Herps in downtown San Francisco, and she could fill up an auditorium with thousands of people, and not that many poets can do that. Anyway, my point is this, and I want to end with this. There is a delicious paradox, is what I wrote, at the heart of artful poetry. And it's what I wrote and how I feel. It can do many practical things for us, poetry that is, unless we lean on it too hard, unless we try and tether it too tightly to some kind of performance on demand, scaled expectation. It's why I say, you can't make a poem do anything, but if it wants to do something, you can't stop it either. Said that for a long time. Poems frequently have us feeling things we do not yet understand. Let me repeat that, because I've seen this so many times before and I've experienced it in my own body. Poems frequently have us feeling things we do not yet understand. Maybe we never will. Yet it's that feeling that is often healing and helpful, even if it stays on some level mysterious. Truth is, perhaps it must stay mysterious to some degree to continue to elevate, heal, and help. I wanted to make this point today in conjunction with this tribute to Mary Oliver, because, I talk about on this podcast wanting to bring poetry that is practical. And yet, again, we never can forget, or at least my feeling is, we can never forget this paradoxical thing, because if we try to force poetry to be practical, it will not put up with that. We can't tether it to this idea of doing some practical thing. And yet, if we let the poem just be, whether we're writing poetry or reading poetry we love, if we let it be, if we let it unfold, if we let it encounter and emerge each moment, each word, line by line, often what we find is that, paradoxically, again, to use that word, it is incredibly practical and helpful. At least that's my story, and I'm sticking with it. What do you think? I'd love to hear what you think about that. And I'd love to hear what you think about this particular episode. If you want to make a comment below, that would be great. And if you want to recommend this to someone else, that would be great. Someone else you think that would appreciate and gain some value out of this podcast, and recommend it. And, put a like down there if you want. I say that primarily because if there are comments and likes, particularly on the YouTube, although, on Apple Podcasts as well, that it creates a context where this podcast will get put in front of more people. And, I just want to spread the poetry around. That's my feeling. Okay, that is a complete wrap. And as I always say, until next time and next poems, please, please take good care of yourself.